Good evening, everyone. And tonight we have come to the end of Elisha's story. We're going to skip over a couple chapters with, the death of Atalia and the crowning of Joash, what happens in Yehuda. So we're going to kind of jump over some historical chapters and come right to Elisha's death. So, and then once we finish talking about kind of that whole scene and how it's kind of the final bit of Elisha setting up the future, as it were, we're going to take a step back and we're going to talk about what we've seen with Eliyahu and Elisha and how that's different from what we generally see when we talk about the classical prophets. The classical prophets being the book prophets. So I will jump in. Does anyone have any questions before I start? No. Okay, great. We're all set. So let's dive in. Yes, here. Okay. So this, you can see here a link to an article, which unfortunately was disappointing. Elisha and the Magic Bow was a disappointing article, I have to say. At any rate, so here we are at 2 Kings chapter 13, Melachim Bet Yud Gimel, and we're starting in the middle with Elisha's sickness. Okay. Elisha chalat choyo asher yamut bo vayered alav Yoash melech Yisrael vayefka panav vayomar avi lechev Yisrael ufarashav. Okay, so Elisha's sick. He's sick with the sickness that he's going to die from it. With no surprises here. No spoiler alert. Elisha's going to die from the sickness. Just so you know, he's sick. Yoash, and apparently it's clear that this is a mortal illness. Yoash, the king of Israel, goes down to cry over him. Probably goes down from the capital city of Shomron. And he says, Avi, lechev Yisrael ufarashav. He says, my father, chariot of Israel and its horsemen, right? Now, of course, it's the same thing that Elisha says when Eliyahu, right, departs. There is a question of course, who does this phrase originate with, right? Because who is it more appropriate for? If we recall, and honestly, the truth is I don't think we have all the Eliyahu stories written down, so we don't know all the Eliyahu stories that it's basing itself on. When Elisha cries out to Eliyahu, my father, chariot of Israel and his horsemen, he's being lifted up by a chariot of the sky, right? But we haven't seen Eliyahu being particularly powerful helping with battle, which is very different from Elisha. Elisha has actually conjured up, remember those chariots of fire that he showed him? He's like, don't worry, we've got like chariots of fire protecting us, right? So Elisha actually does command kind of chariot. He does command this otherworldly army. It's particularly appropriate for Elisha, and it's also appropriate for the king to say it because Elisha has been by the side of the Israelite kings. Again, Elisha has had problems, but at this point, he's well into the Yehu dynasty, right, where they don't worship Baal, right? So he's kind of there with the king, and the king's going to mourn him. And he says to him, and so Elisha is going to do his last kind of act of prophecy here. Prophecy / incantation. Let's see what he does, okay? So Elisha says to him, okay, take a bow and arrows. And he takes a bow and arrows. And then he says to him, Harkev yadcha ala keshet. Harkev, this is this is the only place where it's being used for this. It seems to mean kind of put the bow together, right? Or get it ready, right? And he does. And Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. Now, in this article that I was saying that I'm not particularly wild about, which is Boyd Barrick's Elisha and the Magic Bow, Here you can see what he thinks is going on. This is an Assyrian drawing where you kind of need two people to set it up, and one of them, the person who's helping, actually has his hand over the other person's, and he thinks maybe they're setting up the bow this way. But that's a very specific way to deal with a bow, and I don't think I would do it if it was I was dealing with a sick person who's dying. And I don't see a reason to say that. I do think, and this because he's arguing that there is no symbolic meaning to Elisha putting his hands in the king's hands. Of course, most people do read it as having a special meaning. Like, it tells us there's a reason that we're being told that Elisha is putting his hands on the king's hands, possibly as some kind of saying what you're doing now bears prophetic weight, or some kind of transfer of my power to you. Something like that. I think it's the weight. It's just like, I'm putting my hands on your hands to show you what you're doing now is an extension of my prophecy, right? So what does he do? He says to him, he tells him what to do. He says, open the window east, and he opens it, and he says, shoot, and he shoots it. And vayomer chetz tshu'a la'Hashem v'chetz tshu'a ba'aram v'kita et aram ba'afek ad kaleh. Right? He said, so this is an arrow of salvation to God, to the Lord, an arrow of salvation against Aram, and you shall smite Aram in Afek until they're done. Now we'll see, it's not quite till they're done, right? But the idea is he shot it in the east, so it's the east towards Aram, right? And Aram has been bugging them this whole time. They've been, remember, eating parts of the northern kingdom. And now with this action, this is symbolically showing that he's going to beat Aram. And then he says again to him, he says, says, take the arrows. So he just says to the king, he's like, hit them on the ground. And he hits them 3 times, and then he stops. Okay. ויקצוף עליו איש האלוהים ויאמר להכות 5 או 6 פעמים, אז הכית את ארם עד כלה, ואתה 3 פעמים תכה את ארם. So the man of God got angry at him. He said, if you had struck the ground 5 or 6 times, you really would have wiped out Aram. Now you only did 3 times, so you're only gonna hit them 3 times. Again, the question is, what's going on here? We do have situations in Mesopotamia where arrows are used as oracles, but that doesn't seem to be what's going on here. There's a symbolic action in Egypt. In Egypt, the pharaoh would shoot arrows to all 4 directions to show that he rules over all 4 directions, or that he will rule over all 4 directions. But here, it seems, I mean, obviously the arrow is a symbol of war, right? So he shot out at Aram, and that's going to symbolize that he's going to smite Aram. And now he's beating the arrows on the ground. And the question is, did these actions themselves have magical purpose? Or are they symbolic of, like, the fact that he just hit them 3 times to the ground? It's like, what kind of king just hits them 3 times to the ground? Like, be a man. Hit him a bunch of times. The fact that you are this kind of lazy or not, or like, kind of noodle, you're not gonna smite Aram the way it is, but it clearly is meant to be this kind of symbolic thing. And this is Elisha's final act as a prophet, right? This is his final prophecy. And his final prophecy is wrapped up together with his kind of symbolic / magical actions. Vayomat Elisha v'yikberuhu and that's it. He dies and he's buried. So I just want to go back a little bit again. So the question is, what is meant to be fulfilling the prophecy? Is it the action? Is it the words? Is it both? I think it's both. And there's what words he says in a very short. It seems like also kind of an not exactly oracular, but let's say kind of a short and sweet. Chetz tshu'a la'Hashem v'chetz tshu'a ba'aram. Right? It's an arrow of salvation to the Lord, an arrow of salvation against Aram. That seems like this kind of pronouncement, right? However, it seems like the pronouncement needs some kind of physical action to attach to, as this is what's going to happen, okay? This is going to be important when we talk about symbolic actions later on, particularly in classical prophecy, where it's different, but here we see actually kind of a similar thing to some of the stuff we're going to see in classical prophecy. So Elisha dies and they bury him, and the excuse me, the and troops of Moab are kind of coming into the land. It says Bashana. It seems like there's some kind of mistake there, but it either means at the beginning of the year or at that time during the turning of the year. At any rate, the troops of Moab are regularly invading. And so when these guys were burying this random person, they see a troop, they see it's not really a troop, more like a band of these Moabites. And so they quickly throw the guy in to an open grave, to a grave that's already, they can throw him into, and that grave is Elisha's grave. And the dead man touches Elisha's bones and he comes back to life and he gets up on his feet, right? So that is the final kind of miracle of Elisha, showing you just how powerful Elisha is, that even in death, just as he could in life, he can bring people back to life.
Miriam, it's possible to explain it that when Vayokom al-Raglav is not the other dead person, but Elisha himself. Like it doesn't say who came on his feet.
Yeah, but the question is why? Why would he? Like, because the other guy touched him, he's like, well, I'm not going to stick around here. I'm going to get up and leave.
Well, why should the other guy come alive?
Well, because he touched Elisha's bones. And the idea is that Elisha has magic, it has kind of a magical force in him, right? And also another reason would be is to not desecrate Elisha's grave. In other words, why would this guy come back to life? Because his bones hit Elisha, and it's also inappropriate for him to be buried with Elisha. So he came back to life so that he's gone and he's out of Elisha's grave, right? Like, what would Elisha want? Elisha would want this guy out, right? Maybe that's why. But I don't. You could, let me look at Bechive, come on, my glove. You could read it that way. You could read it that it's Elisha getting up, right? It's a little weird that then there's but you would expect some kind of, even with giving you then the parallel between Eliyahu and Elisha, that neither one really dies, you'd still expect some kind of reaction or something. You know, Elisha gets up and what? You at least expect a pronouncement or something from to say something. And then you could end the story and be like, wow, Elisha's somewhere out there, you know, but you can't just, for him to just come to life. Even though you're right, you could theoretically read it that way.
And another question, Miriam, about the editing of this chapter. Like, it's really sticks out to me that on Pasuk Yud Gimel, Yoash dies, and in the next Pasuk, Yoash talks to Elisha, and it's even the beginning of Yoash's dynasty. If he now is going to prophesy about what's happening later, it's really like sticks out that the editing is horrible here.
Yeah, yeah, it's this kind of, and it's also like, well, this is, let me see, right. And what's interesting is possibly the reason it's done that way is because Yeravam, Yoash's son, is the one who's able to return properties against Aram. In other words, he's the guy who really wins against Aram, right? So Yoash kind of holds him up, but it's his son that we just Yeravam, who actually returns land from Israel, gets it back from Aram in a major way. What we'll see is here, let's take a look. So Chazael pressured Israel all the days of Yehoachaz. And then Vayacham Hashem otam b'rachamim, and then God had mercy on them, right? He didn't leave them, he didn't just abandon them. Chazael, king of Aram, died. Ben-Hadad rules after him. Yehoash takes over, and Yehoash is actually able to take back, because it's not Chazael anymore. And his son is, well, there are a bunch of reasons actually. So Chazael is gone. And his son has taken over. At the same time, the Assyrian policy has changed. So let's remember, usually what happens in Israel is, when do we do well? We do well when our neighbors are distracted with something else, right? So So what happened was Aram was taking chunks out of Israel because Assyria was busy with Babylonia. So Syria wasn't bothering Aram. They were busy with Babylonia. They had a policy, we're just dealing with Babylonia now. At this point, the Syrian policy has changed and they're bugging Aram now. They're attacking Aram. And now is a good time for Israel to take back property. Or take back land. And so what we have is Yehoash actually takes Vayikach Tarim Miyad ben Hadad ben Chazael, Asher Lakach Miyad Yehoachaz Aviv b'Melchama. He takes back those cities that Hadad, the son of Chazael, managed to take from Yehoachaz, his son. What were those cities? Those were not the eastern bank of the Jordan. In other words, he hasn't gotten the stuff in the east of the Jordan. Shalosh pa'amim hikau Yoash v'yeshevet arei Yisrael, right? Yoash smote him 3 times, just as Elisha predicted, and he was able to settle those cities of Israel. It's not till his son is able to take back the eastern bank of the Jordan from and cities from the eastern bank from Aram. So this is the end of Elisha, right? This is Elisha's last prophecy that comes true, right? That they're gonna beat them 3 times, but not beat them. But Yoash himself is not going to beat them completely. And as Ido mentioned, the way it's edited is it tells you all about Yoash, and then it goes back to tell you the story about Elisha. Right, and fill in this relationship between with Aram during Yoash's time. So let me stop sharing now. So that's an end. It actually kind of brings together, it's the end of Elisha. It brings together the 2 aspects of Elisha that we've been seeing, which is his political influence in terms of prophecy and in terms of giving advice regarding battles, and also his miracle working, right? His constant miracle working on a smaller scale as well. And in terms of his use of a symbolic action, so that use of arrows is not dissimilar for when he sweetened the water. He puts salt in, and then he makes a pronouncement. Okay, so you could have the pronouncement as maybe what does it, but it kind of attaches itself to the symbolic action. And in fact, with the story of Naaman, the whole point with Naaman complaining is that he was expecting him to do some magical thing, and he's like, "No, dip in the Jordan," which is not magical, and he defied expectations, right? So here, so it's always a question of these things. What's being done by the action? What's being done by the words? I think that they're clearly supposed to go together in this case. And the idea is that he's making a pronouncement, but the king needs to take an action. I like this actually because what it implies is you've got to do this thing, right? I'm prophesying it, but you've got to do this thing. If you're not ready to do stuff, forget it. That's how I kind of read it a little bit. You've got to shoot the arrow because you are the one who's going to have to win the wars. I see that there's a question or comment from Robin. Elisha is a very big figure in both Christianity and Islam. There are Christian and Islamic sites for his grave, which are associated with miracles. Well, I mean, it would be associated with miracles, right? Thanks for adding that. I've said it before. It's interesting to me that Elisha is less of a figure in Judaism, that he's so much less of a figure in Judaism than Eliyahu is. But the truth is, Eliyahu gets these kind of big theological moments that Elisha doesn't really get, right? He has the big moment on Har Carmel, Mount Carmel. He has the big moment on Chorev. They're both things that you can look at theologically. You can kind of look at it and say, here everyone is saying, Hashem is God. Hashem is God. What does that mean? What are they recognizing when he says, you can't skip over the two? Like, he's got a lot of quotable quotes too. The Kol Damama Daka, right? The thin, small sound. We have these great kind of evocative stories with theological meaning with Eliyahu, whereas Elisha does a lot of miracles and a lot of political Maneuvering isn't even the right word because he doesn't seem to have to maneuver at all. He just says this is what's going to happen, or he chooses the next king, right? So that's Elisha's role. Now, so let's take a step back and say, okay, so what did we see with these? Now, obviously there's Eliyahu, there's Elisha. Before we looked at Eliyahu and Elisha, I'll remind you, we looked at all these kind of little minor, sometimes named, usually nameless prophets that are hanging around northern Israel. We talked a little bit about the king's advisor prophets that we have in the southern kingdom of Judah, right? Of Yehudah. So, and so what makes, how are these different from what we consider like our book prophets or classical prophets? It's called classical prophecy, right? They're very different because these are kind of guys who have a job. They make their short pronouncements. We get a sense of what they're living off of, not always, right? But they're either part of the court or they're part of kind of this group of prophets. They kind of look unusual. They're not, they are like the classical prophets. They can be iconoclasts. They can set themselves up against kings, but they're very much in connection to a king, right? They're in contrast to a king, or they're working with a king, and they are brought in to counsel the king, right? And they don't have big pronouncements to regular people about morality generally. There's like, Eliyahu has this problem with worship of the Baal, and he gets everyone to recognize that, the Lord is God, but his main thing is that there's a royal worship of the Baal, right? He has to shut down state worship of the Baal, right, of Baal, and and also at the same time instill the belief in God in the people, right? But his conflict is mainly with the ruler, right? The king. And many of these prophets that we read about in these books are dealing with a king. We hear about a prophecy when they say it to a king, right? We hear about a rebuke when they're giving a rebuke to a king, right? And that goes in the Judean kingdom also, right? Natan's how it comes to rebuke the king. We don't hear about him rebuking other people, right? Did he rebuke other people? He could very well have. We don't hear about him talking about morality of the people in general. He doesn't seem to, it doesn't seem like it's his job. Now, we don't know, it's very hard to know because we're always working off what has been preserved, right? A story about a prophet yelling at a whole bunch of people is not, that would maybe not be so interesting in the book of Kings, right? When we're reading about a history of kings, hence the name, right? We're reading about these historical histories. We're looking at a top-down history, okay? Once and also we can imagine any of these prophets saying what they say. Usually when they say a pronouncement, we could imagine someone getting up and saying these things in a single setting, right? You can imagine a scene. This guy says this whole prophecy, because it's usually not that long a prophecy. Sometimes it's super short, right? We can totally see that. And what we've seen when we compare it to the ancient Near East, we absolutely have this in the area where a king would call on a prophet and say, hey, what's going to happen, right? And we can even have situations where you have a prophecy that's going different, that the same prophecy that's being transmitted to the king in different ways. And we had an example where a prophecy that the king didn't agree with was being transmitted to him that he ignored to his peril, right? A political prophecy. That's a little bit like Yirmiyahu, who is a classical prophet. But what we have once we get to the book prophets is we have an entire book. And we're like, when did he say this stuff, right? So we can usually if you look even at a short prophet, let's say Hosea or Amos, you're still not going to, you say, okay, but this is beautiful. Like, this is composed. This is literature, right? So did he get up and say this? What was the core prophecy that he got up and said? And what was written, right? So that's something that we are going to talk about next week in terms of how do we see this? How do we interpret it? What makes sense in terms of these book prophecies? And frequently you can kind of put your finger, like not always, but sometimes you can put up your finger on these two core verses seem to be the core of the prophecy. And then the rest of it is kind of this embellishment of the idea. And the question is, like, with Yirmiyahu, at least we know who wrote it down, because we know who the scribe was, because it was Baruch, right? Because he has a scribe whose name is Baruch, and we know this guy wrote his prophecies down in scrolls, right? So that kind of gives us a window into what could have happened. But with early prophets, we just have them kind of going around interacting with political figures and giving these short prophecies and sometimes doing miracles. Now, also another difference that we have between the early prophets and the classical prophets is that classical prophets generally don't do miracles. That's not their thing. They don't do miracles, right? They may be witness to miracles, right? God showed me X, Y, and Z. God lifted me up, but they're not doing miracles for other people. No one expects them to. That's what's interesting. No one is saying to them, hey, you want to prove yourself? Do a miracle. That's not what's going on. Okay, they're not proving themselves with miracles. They're not doing miracles. That's not their thing. One of the things that they are doing that we see less of, it's not completely absent. We see much less of it in early prophecy. They are doing symbolic actions, right? So they're doing things like Yechezkel lying on one side of his body, right, for months at a time, right? Or Yechezkel has fantastic symbolic actions, right? He's like, he eats dung, he makes little walls, he does a lot. He's a very entertaining prophet, clearly, to everyone around him, and it makes that clear too. But Yirmiyahu also has symbolic actions that work in a different way, because Yirmiyahu does things like he wears a loincloth, and then he puts it in a crack where it's going to get moldy. And then God's like, okay, now wear it. And he's like, I can't wear it. It's impossible to wear. And God's like, yeah, that's what Jerusalem is to me, right? And so Yirmiyahu's symbolic actions are kind of trying to prove to Yirmiyahu, it kind of gives him a God's eye view of this is what this is how it is for me, God. Now you, Yirmiyahu, can understand this better and transmit it, right? But they're all there's a lot of symbolic actions floating around at the time of classical prophecy as well. Because if we're looking at Yirmiyahu, he has to confront a false prophet. Yirmiyahu's walking around with a yoke, and the false prophet breaks the yoke from him, and he's like, so we shall break the yoke of Babylonia, right? So there's a level of symbolic action that people take very, very seriously when we're talking about classical prophecy, that doesn't seem to be particularly central when we're talking about the early prophets. Again, at the same time, the early prophets, we read about them in stories. So because we're reading about them in stories, they're not giving us theological treatises, right? They're not telling us how to behave. They're dealing with very specific issues. They're dealing with wars. They're dealing with the immorality of kings, which there's always enough to go around, right? And they're not giving us lessons that people are supposed to take, whereas regular people, right? Whereas the classical prophets do exactly that. They're speaking not just to power, which they are, but they're speaking to all the people around them. And that's a very different kind of prophecy than we see in the stories of Eliyahu and Elisha. Just by definition, that's a completely different focus. To say, you guys are doing the wrong thing, because all of you regular people, all of you are worshiping both Baal and Hashem, and don't you see you can't do that? You all are doing a bad thing, because you all are keeping slaves past the 6th year. Don't you know you're not allowed to do that? And then you took them back. Don't you know you're all allowed to do that? Now God's gonna exile you, right? These are much more much broader. And at the same time, we see, especially with Yirmiyahu, we see them making proclamations to kings. We see Yirmiyahu, especially, who's half a narrative prophet, right? Because we get lots of stories with Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu, he is speaking to the king and constantly being imprisoned by the king. And that's another difference that there seems to be that there seems to be between the early prophets and the classical prophets, possibly. It seems to be much riskier when you have the classical prophets speaking, although it isn't clear, because we certainly have stories with Eliyahu and Elisha where it sounds like the king wants to kill them, or at least they understand it as the king wants to kill me, right? So it's not 100% clear that that's the case. And let's face it, Yirmiyahu, we don't have. Well, it's not true. In the book of Yirmiyahu, we hear about prophets who are killed we have a prophet who's killed for being a false prophet, right? Because he's saying essentially what Yirmiyahu is saying. Yirmiyahu mainly just gets jailed. He has a miserable life, but he lives, right? Yechezkel who is not really in conflict with any king, is very well respected, right? We'll talk a little bit about that later, about what it means to be, what's the status of prophet, right? What has the status of prophet become when we get to classical prophecy? And again, we see with Yirmiyahu is, and you say, oh, well, maybe after we pass from early prophecy, maybe you're just having just a couple prophets here and there. You don't have that many prophets. The thing is that in Jerusalem, Yirmiyahu talks about the prophets as a power class. There is a power group of prophets towards the end of the First Temple period in Jerusalem. Now, there is no more Northern Kingdom. Yeah, there's someone.
Yirmiyahu constantly being threatened with execution.
Oh yeah, sure. There's that great, and we'll talk about it. We'll do the trial, right? Well, chapter 26, right? Chavav, right? We'll do the trial where Yirmiyahu is put on trial for false prophecy, right? Why is he put on trial for false prophecy? Because he says that Jerusalem will fall, and how can that be? That's impossible. So he must be a false prophet, right? That's the underlying idea. That chapter is a lot of fun because in the trial, they bring evidence from another book prophet, Micha. They're like, Micha said this and no one killed him. So you could say that, right? So they kind of bring a precedent, which is fun. So he is, so yeah, it's risky to be a classical prophet. And we're supposed to, but it isn't clear just how risky it is. Like at the time when Yirmiyahu was let off, another guy, it's clear he tries to escape to Egypt and they catch him and they kill him. So we're supposed to understand that Yirmiyahu had a lucky escape, not just a lucky escape, God was on his side. And so he escaped with his life, but he could have been killed, right? We have all sorts of prophets though that you wonder, like Amos, who is prophesying in a capital city against the king and the priest essentially, and the priest is like, get out of here, this is a capital city, you're putting yourself in danger, right? And he himself kind of reports to the king saying, hey, this guy is saying, traitorous things against you, and we would assume that there'd be some kind of follow-up, and there doesn't seem to be a follow-up. There doesn't seem to be an order like, oh yeah, have him killed. It was just like, yeah, okay. Whether or not the king took it seriously, this is not clear. It could be the king just said, oh, just another crazy person, or the king took it seriously in terms of saying the prophet is, you don't just kill a prophet, right? So it isn't super clear how dangerous it is to be a prophet when these classical prophets are walking around. I see you, Cheryl, and I see something from Ido, and just a second. One of the things that we think about in terms of classical prophets is always that they're an iconoclast and they're always against the rulers, right? The one possible exception being Yoel. We'll talk about that later. And that is something that doesn't necessarily follow with early prophets. Early prophets, it's very much like, okay, I'm a prophet. My job is to rebuke the king if he is terrible, and no matter what, to try and help win wars, right? Because that's my job, right? Eliyahu doesn't seem to see his job that way, but Elisha certainly does, or at least to a certain extent. Like he can hate the king, but he still wants them to win against Aram. Whereas when you have these classical prophets, usually the whole reason for their existence is because things have gone horribly wrong. things have gone horribly wrong, and now you need these guys to speak. Okay, now I'm not saying this is always the case. There are exceptions, right? And you have Habakkuk who speaks out against God, as it were, right? Like, how can this be? This is wrong. You have Yoel who is dealing with locusts. So he's dealing with that, and he seems to be possibly a court prophet. So you have exceptions, but we always think of classical prophets as these iconoclasts coming to speak truth to power. And the early prophets do that, but that's only part of their job, because they're also counselors. They're also supposed to help in battle, right?
Why
and
is
that's
this?
Much less with classical prophets.
Why is this, Miriam? Why is the difference between the first prophets and the later prophets?
I don't think, I'll tell you the truth. I don't think it's a difference. And I see also, okay. I'll read some of these things because I'll address all of them together. Did the prophets after Elisha do miracles? Right, that was from you. Could both types of prophets have functioned at the same time? And that kind of dovetails with what I was talking about, with what I was about to say rather. Which is, yes, I don't think that necessarily prophets changed. It's what are we writing about? What do we have books of, right? So in other words, if you've got, because Yirmiyahu talks about there's a class of prophets, right? Who are these class of prophets? What are they doing? And the answer is they're court prophets. They're almost certainly court prophets. They're court prophets that are probably connected to the temple. Okay, we don't read about what they said because they were saying stuff. They were being either counselors to the king, or they're saying everything was going to be okay. We have prophets who are saying, yes, we're going to win against Babylonia. Like we have these other prophets walking around, but also apparently a class of prophet. So it seems like they didn't end. Again, in the northern kingdom of Israel, who knows what happened? Thanks, Robin. In the northern kingdom of Israel, it's hard to know, right? Because they get exiled. But what happened before their exile? So one assumes that there are still prophets roaming around doing things like the early prophets did. And then in Judea, you have court prophets. I imagine they moved away from doing miracles. This is just my imagination, though. Like when miracles became less believable, my assumption is that I think miracles became less believable and they moved away from doing miracles. That's my assumption, but I have no basis for it, right? I don't remember a story in classical prophecy being told about doing a miracle. Someone can correct me here. But absolutely, you could have had these prophets functioning at the same time, and I think we did. I think there absolutely were court prophets, classical, like that functioned like earlier court prophets. Cheryl, yes.
No, just Miriam, I thought of one example, which is not a really big miracle, but when Achaz has a prophecy from, I think it's Yeshayahu, Achaz says, oh, give me a sign, and Yeshayahu tells him, okay, so the sun will move, the shade of the sun in the sun clock will move backwards.
Oh, that's not bad. That's pretty good. Yeah, okay. That's a good one. That's a
it's something.
I think that counts. Yeah.
Miriam, I have a few.
Sure.
One is it seems like the image of Eliyahu in folklore took on a lot of the aspects of Elisha. And is that, I mean, like you said, Elisha isn't known as more, but in folklore, Eliyahu becomes the miracle worker. And
he is a miracle worker. Eliyahu is a miracle worker. He absolutely does miracles. And that's, I would, for me, that's more prominent with Eliyahu. Like it's prominent for both of them, honestly. Eliyahu is very clearly a miracle worker in his stories. He doesn't have to take on that aspect. He brings someone back to life. He has the altar that burns, even though he's poured water all over it. He's absolutely a miracle worker. And look, he goes up to heaven in a chariot of fire. That's pretty impressive, right? So he absolutely is a miracle worker. The question always is, so why does he take on this role of he's going to be the great reconciler, right? He's going to be the one who reconciles between generations. And one assumes, and maybe again, it's as a counterpart to what he's actually known for, which is saying, no, I think that they're wrong. And so I'm going to stand here and like say they're wrong. Maybe it's meant to be kind of the opposite. But I also, it's so hard to know sometimes what stories are being told that we don't have anymore. So I'll give you an example. For example, when Micha says, don't you remember how you were led out of Egypt by Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam? He mentioned they're together. They led you out of Egypt. Now, I will tell you that after I read Shmot, after I read Exodus, I would not have said we were led out of Egypt by Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, right? However, Micha has been hearing other stories. He's been telling, there's a different world of folklore that Micha lives in, where who led us out of Egypt? Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, right? So there's no way that I would have known about that world of folklore if I didn't have Micha telling me about it. So there's who knows what we lost in terms of stories about Eliyahu, right? Because we have this pasuk, this verse from a second temple prophecy saying this is what Eliyahu is going to do. He's going to reconcile between the generations. So who knows what stories they were telling? I certainly don't. We have so little. Actually, this is always a problem when we're dealing. All we have is the written word. And then the question is, and that I think is one of the real differences between early prophecy and classical prophecy, is the written word. In other words, we have these early prophets, we have stories about their lives and things they did. And generally with classical prophets, with a few exceptions, right? Because we have some stories about Yeshayahu and we have stories mixed in with Yirmiyahu, but in general, we have what they said / wrote in long passages. And that by definition, that's going to make it different. The fact that that's the way it's being transmitted is going to make the content, is going to determine the content, right? If you're reading a thing about stories about people doing things, if they gave some long speech about how everyone needs to, keep Shabbos more, it's less likely to be in the historical text, where it's talking about folk, where it's got stories of miracles and kings, right? Whereas once we get into these books of prophecy, that's exactly what you're going to read about, and you're going to know much less about their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The early prophets, we don't see them being, see them being self-reflective about what they're doing as much as we see like Yirmiyahu, other people talking about their role as prophets.
Oh, that is an excellent point. Yes, thank you very much. That is something that is key with classical prophets, or with the longer books. Like the shorter books, we don't usually learn much about how they were chosen. Well, you kind of actually do with some of them. But yes, that whole thing of God chose me to be a prophet. This is my job. What does it mean to be a prophet, right? These are absolutely things that we're going to look at, that the prophets themselves have talk about, right? Yechezkel has a whole thing of what is a prophet's job. Amos has something, what is a prophet's job? Like, what is it? What was it to be chosen? Did I want to be chosen? Of course I didn't. Or yes, I volunteered, right? It's true that the idea of the role of the prophet does play a certain part when we read the classical prophets, even though with Eliyahu, he kind of comes out of nowhere. Elisha is chosen. We don't get that kind of, you're right, we don't get that kind of self-reflection of what do I think my job is, except that with Eliyahu, we have this kind of we have an emphasis on the lack of self-reflection. Where God's like, okay, what now? And he's like completely not self-reflecting. He's like, no, I'm going to say the same thing I said before. Right? So that's kind of it. You could even call it a pivotal moment for Eliyahu, because he doesn't pivot, right? So and that's interesting, because the text, as it were, is pointing out what is the job of a prophet, right? In that way. Well, Eliyahu is not thinking about it, but we are thinking about it when we reflect on that story.
How many years separate early prophets from later prophets?
That's a really good question. I will, me in years. I'll get back to you on that, because I know my guess will be wrong. So I'll look it up and actually do the counting. Something that I forgot to say though was that Elisha functions as a prophet according to the chronology we're given in Kings. He functions for about 50 years, so he functions for a good long time. He functions through a whole bunch of kings. It's long, but it is doable, right? It is possible, right? So he functions for about 50 years as a prophet, which is a nice long time as a prophet. So I don't think that. I mean, if I'm looking at the years, again, I don't want to misspeak. If I'm looking at the years, I don't think there's that many years that would separate the end of Elisha and say the beginning of Yeshayahu, right? I don't think so, but I have to look it up.
You have Amos and Hosea before Yeshayahu.
What?
Amos and Hosea are earlier than Yeshayahu.
Yes, yeah, but you're right, and I should probably look at them. I should look at them, especially Amos. Amos is Uzziah. So if we look, what's the time difference? What's the difference between Yoash and Uzziah? Yoash is 800. Uzziah is one.
Uzziah 750 about 740 maybe.
Okay, so it's very short. It's a very short amount of time that we have between one and the other, and it's when Amos is speaking when things are going very well for the northern kingdom of Israel, right? Things are going very well again because their neighbors are being distracted by the rise of Assyria, right? They're not seeing it coming.
Amos is Yeravam ben Yoash.
Amos is
it's also at the beginning of the book.
Yeah. So there's very little separation actually between those. And again, that brings me back to the to this idea that it's the genre in a lot of ways determines how we see these prophets, right? That it's, are we reading about them in a narrative, or are we reading books of their sayings, right? Who are we not hearing about because they're still kind of narrative prophets in the time of the classical prophets, right? So we're not hearing about them so much, even though you would expect to hear about them. If they were famous, we would hear about them, one assumes, also in the books of Kings, right?
Yeah, but maybe Elisha is one of the latest not book prophets, and we have earlier ones. We have like Achia Shiloni. We have some earlier ones.
We have a bunch of them. We have a ton of them, and we have enough of them that come up and are just named once, that we know there are these random named prophets going around, right? We even have the one, he's like, oh yeah, I hate this guy. And it's not one of our famous ones. It's not Eliyahu, it's not Elisha. It's some guy we never heard of before and we'll never hear of again. But the king knows he hates him, right? The king knows he hates him. So it's like, this is, we know that there are known prophets wandering around who just don't make it into the books, right? They just don't make it in. And again, what we're looking at, and we're going to look at it more when we talk about how do we see prophecies? Like, book prophecies are clearly meant at, I shouldn't say that, because obviously there are people who say, oh yeah, these were written much later for a much different audience, and I usually take it as the book of Amos was pretty much from the time of Amos and stuff from Amos. I'm old-fashioned that way. That's how I read these books. You have to kind of prove to me. I'm like, show me why I shouldn't say that. Like, if you can show me why I shouldn't say that with this chapter or this passage or whatever, then okay. But otherwise, I'm generally going to say, okay, Amos is talking in the time of Uzziah, and it works, right? It matches the period. And so the question is, okay, so who's writing it down? Are people reading it? Is someone supposed to be reading it out loud to people? What's going on? What is supposed to be going on with this book? And then, of course, when we have Amos and Hosea, that are books from the northern kingdom that have to make their way to the southern kingdom in order to be preserved. I mean, the reason we've got them is because they made their way to the Judean kingdom, because what we have is a Judean Bible, let's face it, right? So we have the Bible that they had in Judea when the second temple was destroyed. Everything in it had to make its way to Judea in some way. So Hosea and Amos are both books that were important enough for people, I assume, people running away from the northern kingdom to the southern kingdom were like, hey, they were right. We've got to keep these books, right? So they have an audience, right? People are reading them and thinking about them and believing them, right? And that also is why you can have these prophecies that don't come true in them, right?
Miriam?
And yes,
So Amos is from Yehuda, but he prophesies to Israel.
right.
That may or may not be interesting in the context of the theories of Israel Finkelstein, who I know is very unpopular in traditional circles for obvious reasons, but he insists that in the time of Yeravam ben Yoash, Israel was actually in control of the territory of Yehuda, that Yehuda was subordinate to Israel. That could explain how a prophet from Yehuda is prophesying
Yes,
in
would
Israel.
he even go up there? Right. Would he even go there? Like, why is he, how is he even there? Right. I mean, honestly, you say Yisrael Finkelstein is considered very conservative by academics, archaeology academics now. Yeah, like if you, I was talking to archaeologists in Israel, oh, please, like, because he believes in, because he actually does take biblical books. Oh, he says he doesn't believe in it, but he uses them, he applies them, right? If you're already applying a biblical book to an archaeological site, that's I mean, it's old school. So like, so what I'm saying is feel free to quote Israel Finkelstein. I'm cool with it. I met him. He was a nice guy.
Regarding what Danny said, so it's exactly what happens when Amos is in Beit El. Amatzia, I think the Kohen tells him, don't come here. Ki nikdash melachu, lech v'nabeh b'Yehuda. Go back to Yehuda because
there. He says, get bread there. Why? You're a court prophet, right? Go, they'll pay you there. We don't want you here. Go to Jerusalem, prophesy there, and get food. Go away. And that's when his answer is, Lo navi v'lo ben navi anochi. I am not a prophet, and I'm not part of this guild of prophets that get paid for prophets. I had a business, right? I'm doing stuff, right? I had trees, I had cattle, right? But God chose me to prophesy. Right, my job, and it's because the Amati, he's reacting to him as, you are a prophet for pay. So go away. We're not going to pay you here, and we don't want you here. Go to Jerusalem and get paid there. And he's like, no, I'm the real thing. I'm the real thing. This isn't my job. I had a perfectly nice life, but I'm going to prophesy and tell God and say the word of God. Now, I want to finish with Robin has a question, and I know we're at the end of the time. How come the kings allowed the prophets to criticize them? Did the kings of surrounding cultures allow such behavior? So we have in Mesopotamia, there's an example of a letter not criticizing, but where someone is reporting what a prophet said, and he knows the king's not going to like it. He knows the king is not going to like hearing what the prophet said. And he says to him, he writes him a letter, and he's like, where I used to live, it was important, I considered it important to always report to the king what was going on. Because if I don't report it and something happens, it's on me. So I want to tell you about this thing. Like he has this whole like prelude to being able to report this stuff that he knows the king's not going to like, right? And we have that other example of the queen going and getting a prophecy that is pro-king, like saying, yay, he's going to win. And she has to say to the king, I know you're going to say they were lying, but I'm telling you they weren't lying, right? They weren't just telling me what I wanted to hear because I was paying them, because you can't make a prophet say something other than what they want to say, right? So you see that there was this kind of acknowledgement that a prophet is not always going to say things you want to hear, right? Whether a prophet's going to say you are horrible, I don't think that would generally have been considered okay. And in fact, we see with the way Achav and Eliyahu kind of spar, that when that Eliyahu at certain times feels that he's in danger from Achav. I imagine in their role as counselor, they might be able to say things that would be very blunt. I'm not 100% sure, because in the stories they do. But is this normal behavior? Yirmiyahu gets put in jail, right? He's not killed, he's put in jail. There's an idea here also that kings, if you believe in prophets, and you're like, this guy, he's a man of God, and maybe he's wrong, but maybe he's right. And maybe I don't want to kill a man of God who's right, So that seems to be an issue. It is a question with Amos, for example, why he didn't just say have him killed. Clearly, the priest he writes to the king, but there's no kind of reaction. So either the king doesn't care, or the king doesn't want to start up with a prophet. Right? It's not, there is a classic phrase that you killed my prophets, right? So it could be complete exaggeration, or it could be the prophets did get killed, like more than once. We have a prophet here or there that gets killed, but like was it a thing that happened often? And that's one of these things that I think some of these prophets had enough of a following or people believing in them that the king was like, you know what? Better not kill them, right? Also, kings, it's not like today, if you have an autocrat and someone talks against him, even with a following, he can kill him or put him in jail or do whatever he wants. And he's like, but I own all of you. Like, I have total control. So there's nothing you can do. I don't think that there was such a thing, particularly in Judah and Israel. You could always be overthrown. So if you've got Yirmiyahu and he's talking to a whole courtyard full of people and everyone's gathering to listen to him, and then you kill him, that's probably not going to be great for your already somewhat shaky royal status, right? So that also may have been part of it. I mean, these guys had people listening to them. Okay, from Susan, it's just a 19th century opera and it's a priest, not a prophet. But the king of Egypt consults with the high priest of Egypt as to who. Oh, Aida. Yeah, sure. I don't know where Verdi got the idea, but it is the sort of thing that you might consult with a prophet for. I don't know if you would consult with him about a commander, but you could. I suppose you could ask a prophet who should command the army, but you would assume that someone was paying someone behind the scenes. Like that prophet, if you're asking the prophet who should command the army, someone is paying that prophet. Like someone's bribing that prophet. You're just setting it up. I'm sorry. Okay, last question, Cheryl. Yeah.
Wouldn't the kings and everybody else assume that these Nevi'im were getting the message from God? And so I wouldn't want to mess with that.
Well, I mean, that's the idea, but we do know that it, first of all, it could backfire, like we saw in the story with Elisha and Siege, where it's like, you're the man of God and God has apparently abandoned us. Here's this horrible situation. You are dead, right? Or it could also be a situation where, you're a king and you're kind of skeptical, or you also have prophets telling you different things. So with Yirmiyahu, you have all these prophets who are saying Babylon is going to fall. We should rebel. And so which prophet do you listen to, right? Also, a prophet who comes right up to you and says, you are a jerk, you are going to die, right? So is that a prophecy or is that just treason, right? So that there's that thing also, where do you cross the line? And we do sometimes kind of feel that with prophets, both early and classical prophets, that they're kind of dancing along a line. You actually don't know what's going to happen. But of course, God's on their sides, they live, right? With that, I will conclude because our time is up. But in the next class, I'd like to talk more about kind of the structure of classical prophecy, and again, what we were talking about is finding like the core of prophecy, and then the elaboration. What does it mean? How could it have? What could it have meant kind of in situ, which is a big topic. So we'll see how far we get, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. So have a good night, everyone.